Beneath the marble halls of Monticello, Virginia's most celebrated estate, there was a room that never appeared on any official tour, no blueprint, no public record, no plaque for visitors to read. For nearly 4 decades, this concealed chamber hid a truth so dangerous that 3 U.S. presidents, dozens of congressmen, and an entire political dit Nasty worked relentlessly to erase it from history. The room measured just 14 feet by 12 with a single window facing the servants' quarters. Within those walls, at least 6 children were born to a woman who had no legal right to refuse the man who owned her. That man was Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, champion of liberty, and defender of human freedom, who kept his enslaved mistress in a space deliberately designed to be forgotten. What makes this story truly chilling isn't only what happened inside that hidden room, but what came after. A coordinated silence, destroyed letters, altered family accounts, and carefully crafted lies that lasted more than 200 years. The truth was so threatening that Jefferson's own grandchildren carried contradictory stories to their graves, each version shaped to protect the family name and preserve the myth. Tonight on Vintage Chains, we step into the shadows of America's most revered founding father and unknown over what history tried to bury beneath Monticello's polished legacy. Before we continue, I want you to be part of this conversation. If you're watching from Virginia or from any country, why around the world, leave a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. And make sure to subscribe to Vintage Chains and turn on notifications, because these are the stories they never taught us in school and they deserve to be heard. Let's continue, and most importantly, stay with me until the end, because what we uncover gets darker with every revelation. The secrets of Monticello didn't begin with a hidden room. They began with a calculation made by a man who understood that power in the end answers to no one. Albemarle County, Virginia was a landscape of contradictions. The rolling hills stretched green, and abundant tobacco fields generating wealth that would shape a nation, while the labor that made such prosperity possible remained invisible in every deal. Human of importance, Thomas Jefferson was 30. The name itself spoke to Jefferson's pretensions, a Virginia plantation owner who fancied himself a Renaissance man, an architect, a philosopher, scientist. The mansion he designed was unlike anything in colonial America. Jefferson obsessed over every detail. The angles of the light through the windows, the hidden staircases that allowed enslaved servants to move through the house without being seen by guests, the dumbwaiter systems that brought wine from the cellar so that no human hand need be visible during elegant dinners. He was creating quite literally a stage set for democracy, a place where the ideals of liberty could be discussed over French wine and European delicacies, while the machinery of slavery hummed just out of sig. Martha Jefferson brought more than her considerable charm to this marriage. She brought property, land, and 40 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was a girl named Sar. Though everyone called her Sally. She was 14 years old, light-skinned enough that visitors would later describe her as nearly white, and she was Martha Jefferson's half-sister, John Wales, Martha's father, had fathered Sally with an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings after his wife's death. This made Sally both Martha's property and her blood relation, a contradiction that no one in polite Virginia society would ever acknowledge aloud. The Hemings family occupied a peculiar position at Monticello. They were house servants, not field laborers, trained in specialized skills. Sally's brothers worked as butlers, chefs, and craftsmen. Her mother, Elizabeth, held a position of authority over other enslaved people. They spoke French, played musical instruments, and understood the subtle protocols of entertaining Virginia's elite. But they were still property, still subject to sale, punishment, or any use their owner deemed appropriate. In those early years, Sally was simply part of the household machinery, a girl who learned to be invisible while standing in plain sight. She attended to Martha Jefferson, who suffered from fragile health, bearing children in quick succession. and growing weaker with each pregnancy, the mansion itself seemed to reflect Martha's decline. Rooms remained unfinished, construction halted and restarted. Based on Jefferson's changing visions and available funds, there were spaces in the house that existed in perpetual transition. Rooms whose purposes shifted, alcoves that appeared on one blueprint and vanished from the next. It's worth understanding what Monticello represented to Thomas Jefferson. This wasn't merely a home. It was a philosophical statement. He filled it with inventions, curiosities, fossils, and Native American artifacts. He installed a 7-day clock in the entrance hall that told not just the time, but the day of the week. He designed his bed in an alcove between two rooms so he could rise and immediately begin working. Everything was about efficiency, control, and the illusion that a rational mind could organize the world into perfect harmony. But beneath this carefully constructed rationality lay dependencies Jefferson could never publicly acknowledge. The entire state ran on enslaved labor, over 100 people at its peak. T. Jefferson wrote passionately about the evils of slavery, even as he bought, sold, and bred human beings to maintain his lifestyle. He calculated that enslaved women produced a 4% annual return on investment through their children. He recorded these calculations in his farm journals right alongside crop rotations and weather observations. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble him, or perhaps it troubled him so deeply that he built an entire architecture of denial around it. The community of Albemarle County understood these contradictions without discussing them. Every plantation owner lived the same lie. They were gentlemen scholars, enlightened farmers, patriots who spoke of liberty while their wealth rested on stolen labor and stolen lives. The unspoke. An agreement was simple. We do not examine too closely the foundations upon which our civilization rests. To question one man's moral compromises would require questioning everyone's. This was the world into which Sally Hemings disappeared, not through any dramatic event, but through the simple fact that women who looked like her, who lived as she did, were never supposed to be visible. Lend the historical record at all. Martha Wales. Jefferson died 4 months after giving birth to her 6th child, only 3 of whom survived infancy. The official cause was complications from childbirth, but everyone at Monticello understood. She'd been dying slowly for years, her body worn out by pregnancy and a constitution too delicate for Virginia's humid summers. Thomas Jefferson's grief was absolute. Witnesses described him pacing his room for 3 weeks, emerging only for brief walks where he seemed not to see the world around him. He burned all of his wife's letters. Everyone, as if he could erase her suffering by erasing her words. Before Martha died, she made Jefferson promise something. The exact words of that promise were never recorded, but family lore suggests she asked him never to remarry. The prospect of a stepmother ruling over her children was more than she could bear. Jefferson agreed, and he kept that promise for the remaining 44 years of his life. But promises, like architectural plans, can have hidden meanings and secret spaces. In the months following Martha's death, the household descended into a kind of controlled chaos. Jefferson threw himself into politics, accepting appointments that would take him away from Monticello for years at a time. The children needed care. The house needed management, and Sally Hemings, now 19 years old, found her role shifting in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just months before. Jefferson accepted the position of minister to France, replacing Benjamin Franklin in Paris. He took his eldest daughter Martha with him, but the younger children remained at Monticello under the care of relatives. Paris in the 1780s was a revelation for Jefferson, a city of culture, philosophy, and revolutionary ideas. He moved in circles that included the future architects of the French Revolution, men who spoke of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. The hypocrisy of his situation and enslaver preaching freedom seems not to have occurred to him, or perhaps occurred to him constantly, driving the meticulous compartmentalization that characterized his entire life. Jefferson summoned his youngest daughter, Polly, to join him in Paris. An 8-year-old girl could not make the transatlantic voyage alone. The person selected to accompany her was S.A. Hemings, now 24 years old. The choice was deliberate. Sally was literate, spoke some French, and was considered trustworthy. She was also Martha Jefferson's half-sister, creating a family conic, time that everyone acknowledged in private, and no one mentioned in public. The voyage took 7 weeks. By the time they arrived in Paris, something had shifted, or perhaps it had shifted long before in the quiet spaces of Monticello, where grief and proximity and absolute power created their own logic. Paris offers Sally Hemings something impossible in Virginia, the realization that she was, under French law, free. Any enslaved person who set foot on French soil was automatically emancipated. She could have walked away. Some historians suggest Jefferson explained this to her. Others believe she discovered it through the community of free Black Americans living in Paris at the time. What we know with certainty is that Sally Hemings became pregnant in Paris. She was approximately 16 years old. Thomas Jefferson was 44 and one of the most prominent Americans in Europe. The relationship, if we can call it that, existed in a space where consent was impossible. Jefferson owned Sally. He owned her mother, her siblings, her future children. In Virginia, she had no legal right to refuse him. In Paris, she had freedom within reach. But return to America would mean returning to bondage. Years later, Sally's son, Madison Hemings, would recount what his mother told him about Paris. She negotiated. Madison said she agreed to return to Virginia in exchange for a promise that any children she bore Jefferson would be free when they reached the age of 21. It was the only leverage she possessed, the threat to stay in FR, hence to make their relationship public in a place where it would destroy Jefferson's reputation among the very revolutionaries he courted. Whether Jefferson truly promised this, or whether Madison constructed a narrative that gave his mother some agency in an impossible situation, we'll never know with certainty. What matters is what happened next. Sally Hemings returned to Virginia pregnant. With Jefferson's child, she returned to slavery. She returned to a house that would become her prison for the next 38 years. The room that would become hers existed in a peculiar space of Monticello's architecture, located on the South Dependency. It connected to the main house through Jefferson's complex system of service corridors. Visitors to Monticello would tour the public spaces, admire Jefferson's inventions and his library, and never realize that enslaved servants lived in a warren of small chambers dug into the hillside, rooms that appeared on no published architectural plans. Sally's room had one window, a narrow opening that provided light, but faced away from the main entrance, away from anywhere guests might wander. The room was furnished simply. A bed, a small table, a chair. By the standards of enslaved housing, it was comfortable. By the standards of humanity, it was a cage lined with muslin and deception. The first child Sally bore Jefferson died in infancy. No record of this child exists in Jefferson's meticulous farm books, where he recorded the birth of every other enslaved child on the plantation. This absence is itself a record. A silence that speaks to the extraordinary efforts made to keep this relationship hidden. Between 1795 and 1808, Sally Hemings gave birth to at least 6 more children, for survived Adol, Thud, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. These children grew up in a strange twilight existence. They were enslaved, but they were Jefferson's children, and everyone at Monticello knew it. They were given training in skilled trades. They were taught to read and write, illegal for enslaved people in Virginia, but essential for Jefferson's vision of their future. They were kept close to the main house, rarely if ever, working in the fields, and they were light-skinned enough that once freed, they could pass as white in American society. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged these children, not once in thousands of pages of letters, journals, in documents did he mention Sally Hemings as anything other than inventory. Yet, the evidence of their relationship was everywhere. Guests remarked on the enslaved children at Monticello, who bore striking resemblances to Jefferson. One visitor noted that young Harriet Hemings looked so much like Jefferson's white daughter, Martha, that they could be twins. These observations were written down, whispered about, and then carefully forgotten, buried under layers of social convention and willful ignorance. S.A. Like Hemings herself became a ghost within Monticello's walls. Unlike other enslaved people, she never appeared in visitor accounts. She served no meals, greeted no guests, participated in no public aspect of plantation life. She existed in that hidden room, emerging only when Jefferson was present, vanishing from view when he traveled to Washington or entertained political allies. This invisibility was intentional, carefully orchestrated. Jefferson's white family, his daughters and grandchildren who lived at Monticello, maintained a fiction that their grandfather Z, enslaved mistress, simply didn't exist. The architecture of Monticello facilitated this deception. Jefferson had designed the house so that enslaved servants could move through it without being seen. A system of narrow staircases and service corridors meant that meals appeared as if by magic. Fires were tended without visible hands, chambers were cleaned while the family breakfasted. His same system allowed Sally to remain hidden, a secret built into the foundations of the house itself. But secrets have a way of seeping out like water through cracks in plaster. A political enemy of Jefferson's named James Callender published accusations in the Richmond Recorder. Callender, a scandal-monger who felt Jefferson had betrayed him, claimed the president was keeping a slave mistress named Sally and had fathered multiple children with her. He even published crude verses mocking Jefferson. The accusations created a brief political scandal, but Jefferson's allies rawled. They denounced Callender as a drunk and a liar. They suggested that if any impropriety had occurred at Monticello, it involved one of Jefferson's nephews, not the great man himself. They pointed to Jefferson's impeccable character, his devotion to his late wife's memory, his standing as a philosopher and statesman. The accusations faded, but they never entirely disappeared. They lingered in political gossip and whispered asides, in the knowing looks exchanged by Virginia's plantation aristocracy. What's remarkable is how easily the public accepted the denials. Jefferson himself never directly addressed the accusations. He maintained absolute silence, and this silence was interpreted as dignity, as being above such base attacks. His family closed ranks. His daughter, Arthur Jefferson Randolph, who lived at Monticello and surely knew the truth, denied everything. She insisted that the Hemings children resembled Jefferson only because they resembled his nephew, Peter C.R., who she claimed was their actual father. This lie would be repeated for generations, a carefully maintained fiction that allowed Jefferson's descendants to preserve his reputation. Meanwhile, in her small room in Monticello's South Dependency, Sally Hemings continued to exist in the shadows. She was approximately 30, mother to children who were simultaneously enslaved and privileged, living a life of extraordinary constraint and quiet horror. She could not leave. She could not speak publicly. Her entire existence depended on maintaining the fiction of her own invisibility. The room itself bears examination. Historical archaeologists who excavated Monticello in the late 20th century uncovered the foundations of the South Dependency. Those hidden chambers were inns. Laid servants lived. They found buttons, fragments of ceramics, medicine bottles. The material detritus of lives lived just out of history's sight. Sally's specific room has never been definitively identified, but we know it existed. We know she lived apart from other enslaved people in a space that connected directly to Jefferson's private quarters through those secret corridors. We know the architecture was designed to keep her both close and hidden. Think about what this means. Every architectural choice Jefferson made, every corridor and staircase and carefully angled wall served had dual purposes. The house was a stage for Enlightenment ideals, and it was a machine for keeping shameful truths hidden. The same ingenuity that Jefferson applied to his inventions, his rotating book stands, and his hideaway beds he applied to concealing Sally Hemings, the room where she lived, where she bore his children, where she spent decades of her life, was designed from the baby, named to be forgotten. As Thomas Jefferson aged, the contradictions of his life became more pronounced. He served 2 terms as president, leading the young nation while maintaining his secret domestic arrangement. Letters from this period reveal a man increasingly anxious about his legacy. He began organizing his papers, burning correspondence he deemed too private, carefully curating the documentary record that would survive him. He must have known that the truth about Sally Hemings posed a danger to his reputation. The question is whether he ever considered that danger worth confronting honestly. Jefferson retired permanently to Monticello at 66. He was an old man by the standards of his era, increasingly frail and burdened by debts that would plague him until death. The plantation was no longer profitable. Tobacco had exhausted the soil. Jefferson's expensive tastes, his wines, his books, his constant renovations to Monticello had created a financial -1. Yet he continued to maintain over 100 enslaved people, continuing to calculate their value as assets. Even as he professed to despise the institution of slavery, Sally Hemings was now in her late 30s, past the age when most enslaved women could expect to survive given the brutal conditions of plantation life. But she had been spared the worst of that brutality. Her children were growing up. Beverly, the eldest surviving son, was learning carpentry. Harriet was being trained in textile work, spinning and weaving. Madison and Eston, the youngest boys, were still children, but already receiving educations that set them apart from other enslaved people on the plantation. Jefferson's white grandchildren, who lived at Monticello during these retirement years, later left conflicting accounts of this period. Some insisted they never saw Sally Hemings, that she was simply another servant who kept to the background. Others admitted they knew of her existence, but claimed she had no special status. One granddaughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, would later write letters vehemently denying any relationship between Jefferson and Sally, insisting that the Hemings children were fathered by Jefferson's nephew. These letters are remarkable for their passion, their desperation to protect a dead man's reputation at the cost of an obvious truth. But there were cracks in the family's unified denial. Israel Jefferson, an enslaved man who worked at Monticello, would later testify that Sally Hemings' children were Jefferson's. Madison Hemings himself would give an interview in 1873 describing his parentage matter-of-factly, explaining how his mother had negotiated for her children's freedom. These accounts were dismissed at the time as unreliable, the testimony of formerly enslaved people who might have reasons to lie, but now with historical distance and DNA evidence, we recognize them as truth. The most chilling aspect of this period is the systematic nature of the cover-up. It wasn't just Jefferson hiding the truth. It was his entire family, his political allies, the community of Albemarle County, and eventually the age. Historians who first read his biography, everyone with power and influence worked consciously or unconsciously to maintain the fiction. Sally Hemings had to remain invisible because acknowledging her meant acknowledging that Thomas Jefferson, champion of liberty, was a hypocrite of the highest order. It meant confronting the fact that the man who wrote, "All men are created equal," owned his own children. Beverly Hemings turned 21 and simply walked away from Monticello. He crossed into free territory and disappeared into white society. Jefferson recorded his departure in his farm book with a single word: run. It was a lie. Of course, Beverly didn't run. He left with Jefferson's implicit permission, fulfilling whatever promise had been made back in Paris all those years ago. 2 years later, Harriet did the same. Jefferson gave her $50 and arranged for her passage on a stagecoach north. She vanished into white society, eventually marrying a white man who never knew her true parentage. Madison and Eston, the youngest, were formally freed in Jefferson's will. This was unusual. Most enslaved people at Monticello were sold after Jefferson's death to pay his debts, but these two young men, Jefferson's sons, were given their freedom in writing. Even then, Jefferson couldn't acknowledge the relationship publicly. The will simply stated that Madison and Eston Hemings were to be freed in consequence of faithful service. The language was clinical, legal, devoid of any hint of parental obligation. Sally Hemings herself was never formally freed. Jefferson's will did not mention her. Instead, his daughter Martha allowed Sally to leave Monticello informally after Jefferson's death. Sally went to live with her sons Madison and Eston in Charlottesville, where she spent her final years. She died in 1835, approximately 62 years old, in a small house in town. The white community of Charlottesville knew who she was. They knew she had been Jefferson's mistress, but they said nothing publicly, maintaining the polite fiction even after everyone involved was dead. The true horror of this story isn't just what happened to Sally Hemings, it's what happened too. The truth, for over 150 years, historians, Jefferson biographers, and the keepers of his legacy actively worked to suppress, deny, and discredit a wise suggestion of the relationship. This wasn't passive forgetting. This was active historical erasure, a conspiracy of silence that involved some of the most respected scholars in America. The Thomas S. Jefferson Foundation, which maintains Monticello as a museum and historical site, spent most of the 20th century denying the Sally Hemings story. When Madison Hemings' 1873 interview surfaced, scholars dismissed it. When oral histories from the Hemings family were presented, they were ignored. The Foundation's official position was that the relationship was possible, unproven, and more likely involved Jefferson's nephews rather than Jefferson himself. This position was maintained despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the timing of Sally's pregnancies coinciding with Jefferson's presence at Monticello, the physical resemblances multiple observers noted, the special treatment of Hemings' children, and the testimony of people who had actually lived at the plantation. Why did this matter so much? Because Thomas Jefferson is foundational to American identity. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He embodied Enlightenment ideals. He represented the best of what the founding generation aspired to be, admitting that he owned and repeatedly impregnated an enslaved woman beginning when she was as young as 14 and he was in his mid-40s. Men admitting that the entire founding mythology was built on a lie. It meant confronting the reality that the men who wrote eloquently about freedom were simultaneously engaged in one of history's greatest crimes. The conspiracy to hide the truth had many layers. Jefferson's immediate family, as we've discussed, denied everything, but the cover-up extended far beyond them. Early biographers of Jefferson had access to evidence of the Hemings relationship, but chose not to include it in their published works. They judged that such information would damage Jefferson's reputation and therefore harm the nation itself. The logic was circular and self-serving. Jefferson must be protected because he represents America's ideals, and America's ideals must be protected because they're embodied by men like Jefferson. Academic historians joined the conspiracy, though many wouldn't have thought of it that way. They demanded impossibly high standards of proof for the Hemings story while accepting much flimsier evidence for other aspects of Jefferson's life. When oral histories from enslaved people were offered as evidence, scholars dismissed them as unreliable. When DNA testing became available in the 1990s, there was fierce resistance to applying it to Jefferson's descendants. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation fought against DNA testing for years, arguing it would be disrespectful to Jefferson's memory. Think about what this means. For more than a century and a half, the story of Sally Hemings was treated as scandalous rumor, something respectable. People didn't discuss. Her children and grandchildren, who knew the truth intimately, were dismissed as liars or confused. The material evidence, the room where she lived, the records of her children's births, the correspondence that hinted at the truth was systematically ignored or reinterpreted. And all of this was done in the name of protecting history, preserving Jefferson's legacy, and maintaining American myths about its founding. The room itself, that hidden chamber in Monticello's South Dependency, became a physical manifestation of this historical denial after the Civil War. When Monticello fell into disrepair, the South Dependency deteriorated. The rooms where enslaved people had lived collapsed, were covered by vegetation, were literally buried under earth. And time when the Thomas Jefferson Foundation began restoring Monticello in the early 20th century, they focused on the main house, the public spaces, the areas where Jefferson's genius as an architect was most visible. The servants' quarters were left buried. It wasn't until 1941 that archaeologists began excavating the South Dependency. They found the foundations of rooms, the artifacts of daily life, evidence of the hidden world that had sustained Monticello's elegant facade. But even then, even as they uncovered these spaces, the historians and curators didn't connect them to S.A. Like Hemings, they described them generically as servants' quarters and moved on. The specific room where Sally lived, where she bore Jefferson's children, remained unidentified and unmarked. Visito. Artists to Monticello in the mid-20th century would tour the house and never hear Sally Hemings' name. Tour guides were instructed not to mention her. If visitors asked about the calendar allegations from 1802, guides were trained to dismiss them as political slander. The official Monticello tour was a carefully choreographed performance presenting Jefferson as a Renaissance man, a loving grandfather, a brilliant architect, and a reluctant slaveholder who privately despised the institution. The fact that he held his own children in bondage, that he maintained a decades-long sexual relationship with an enslaved woman who had no legal right to refuse him, was simply erased from the narrative. This erasure required constant effort. New evidence kept surfacing. Researchers discover Ed Jefferson's farm books, which recorded the births of Sally's children and correlated precisely with Jefferson's documented presence at Monticello. They found Jefferson's expense records showing all treatment for the Hemings family. They analyzed the timing of pregnancies and Jefferson's travels, finding perfect correspondence. Each piece of evidence was explained away, reinterpreted, or simply ignored. The conspiracy even extended to physical spaces. When the Thomas Jefferson Foundation finally acknowledged in the 1990s that the relationship likely occurred, they still struggled, led with how to present it to the public. Where do you place Sally Hemings in a tour of Monticello? How do you discuss the rape of an enslaved teenager by America's third president without destroying his reputation entirely? The Foundation's solution was compromise. They acknowledged the relationship but emphasized that we can't know whether it was consensual, as if consent were possible in such circumstances. They mentioned Sally Hemings, but kept the focus on Jefferson's greatness. The truth began to slip through the cracks long before Thomas Jefferson's death, but the conspiracy to contain it was already in motion. When James Callender published his accusations in the Richmond Recorder Jefferson made a calculated decision. Absolute silence. He would not dignify the charges with a response. His political allies rallied immediately, flooding newspapers with denials, character assassinations of Callender, and alternative explanations. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Make enough noise around the accusation that the accusation itself becomes lost in the chaos. But Callender had sources. He had spoken to people who had visited Monticello, who had seen Sally Hemings, who had noted the resemblances between Jefferson and certain enslaved children. His descriptions were too specific to be pure invention. He wrote about dusky Sally and her children, naming them, describing their appearances, even estimating their ages with accuracy that suggested real information. Jefferson's allies countered by suggesting that if any impropriety had occurred, it involved Jefferson's nephews, Samuel and Peter Carr, sons of his sister. This alternative narrative was planted deliberately, and it would be repeated for over a century. The Carr brothers never publicly confirmed or denied these allegations. Samuel Carr died in 1855, Peter in 1815. Neither left any statement about the paternity of Sally Hemings' children. Their silence was convenient. Dead men could be blamed without consequence. Jefferson's daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, who lived at Monticello throughout her father's relationship with Sally, became the chief architect of publicly acknowledged was that she had lived in the same house as her father's enslaved mistress for decades. She had seen Sally Hemings pregnant, had seen the children born, had noted the resemblances that visitors remarked upon, but acknowledging this meant acknowledging that her father, the great Thomas Jefferson, was a hypocrite who preached liberty while holding his own children in bondage. It meant acknowledging that her inheritance, Monticello itself, was built on stolen labor and sexual violence. So she lied and she taught her children to lie, and those children taught their children. Jefferson himself went to his grave without ever addressing the allegations. He died on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was signed. The symbolism was noted widely. Jefferson, author of America's founding document, dying on its anniversary. The newspapers eulogized him as a patriot, a philosopher, a statesman. Not one major obituary mentions Sally Hemings or the scandal that had dogged his presidency. The conspiracy of silence had succeeded, but death brought complications Jefferson hadn't fully anticipated. He died deeply in debt, over $107,000, an astronomical sum for 1826. Monticello and everything in it would have to be sold to satisfy creditors. This included the enslaved people, over 100 human beings who would be auctioned off to pay for Jefferson's expensive tastes, his wines and books and architectural ambitions. Jefferson's will made provisions for only 5 enslaved people to be freed: Madison Hemings, Eston Hemings, and 3 of Sally's nephews. The language was carefully neutral. They were being freed for their faithful service, not because they were Jefferson's children. Sally Hemings herself was not mentioned in the will. This omission was deliberate. Formally freeing Sally would have required explaining why she deserved this privilege when other enslaved women at Monticello did not. It would have drawn attention to her special status, raising questions Jefferson's family was desperate to avoid. Instead, Martha Randolph simply allows Sally to leave Monticello after the estate was settled. It was an informal arrangement, a gentleman's agreement that avoided legal documentation. Sally went to live with her N.S. Madison and Eston in Charlottesville, existing in a kind of legal gray area, not formally enslaved, but not officially free either. The auction of Monticello's enslaved people took place 6 months after Jefferson's death. Families were separated, children sold away from parents, husbands separated from wives. The sale was brutal and thorough. Jefferson's financial legacy, the debt he left behind, was paid in human flesh. The enslaved people who had built Monticello, maintained it, made Jefferson's life of philosophical leisure possible, were scattered across Virginia and beyond. Many of them knew the truth about Sally Hemings and Jefferson, but who would listen to the testimony of enslaved people at an auction? The room where Sally had lived was empty, closed up, forgotten. Monticello itself was sold in 1831 to a man named James Barclay, who had no connection to Jefferson and no interest in preserving the estate as a shrine. The house fell into disrepair. The ingenious mechanical systems Jefferson had installed broke down. The gardens grew wild. The South dependency, where enslaved people had lived in those hidden chambers, began to collapse. Weather and neglect did what Jefferson's family could not. They traced the physical evidence of Sally's existence at Monticello. Sally Hemings died in 1835, approximately 62 years old. The Charlottesville newspaper ran a brief notice. Sally Hemings, a colored woman, died. No mention of her connection to Jefferson. No acknowledgement of the children she had borne to one of A.M. Erica's founders. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Monticello graveyard, a cemetery for free blacks and poor whites in Charlottesville. The location of her grave was not recorded with precision. Within a generation, no one could say with certainty where Sally Hemings lay buried. Her children scattered, each making different choices about how to navigate freedom in a country that defined them by their mother's enslaved status, while denying their father's identity. Beverly Hemings disappeared into white society completely. He moved north, changed his name, married a white woman, and never looked back. His descendants would grow. District of Columbia as a white man working as a carpenter. He died in the 1850s. The exact date and location lost to history. Harriet Hemings, Sally's only surviving daughter, also passed into white society. Jefferson had given her $50 and arranged her passage on a stagecoach to Philadelphia in 1822. When she was 21, she disappeared into Th. East City's population, married a white man, and lived as white for the rest of her life. Her husband never knew her true parentage. When she died sometime in the 1860s, she was buried as a white woman under her married name. The secret went with her to the grave. Madison and Eston Hemings initially remained connected to their mother and to the black community in Charlottesville. Both men worked as carpenters, the trade they had learned. At Monticello, Madison married a free black woman named Mary Hughes McCoy in 1834. They had children, established a household, lived openly as black people in Virginia, but Virginia in the 1830s was increasingly hostile to free blacks. Laws were tightened, restrictions multiplied. The fear of slave rebellions after Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 made W.H. Virginians suspicious of any black person not under direct white control. In 1836, Eston Hemings and his family left Virginia entirely. They moved to Chillicothe, Ohio, where they lived as black people initially, but Ohio, to Eston H. Jefferson, claiming the surname Oakley for the first time. He moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where he lived as a white man until his death in 1856. His children grew up white, married white spouses, and their descendants had no idea they carried Thomas Jefferson's blood mixed with that of an enslaved woman. Madison Hemings remained in Ohio, living as a black man, working as a carpenter, raising his family in the small black community of Chillicothe. He was 68 years old in 1873 when a local newspaper editor named S.F. Wetmore interviewed him for the Pike County Republican *. Madison told his story plainly without dramatics or embellishment. He described his grandmother Elizabeth Hemings, his mother Sally T. He relationship with Thomas Jefferson that everyone at Monticello knew about, but no one discussed publicly. He explained how his mother had negotiated in Paris for her children's freedom. He named his siblings, described their fates, spoke about growing up at Monticello as Jefferson's enslaved son. The interview was published on March 13, 1873. It should have been a sensation. The son of Thomas Jefferson speaking on the record about his parentage, but it wasn't. Most newspapers ignored it. The few that noticed dismissed it as the confused ramblings of an old black man seeking attention. Jefferson's white descendants denounced it as lies. Historians already constructing the heroic narrative of Jefferson that would dominate textbooks for the next century saw no reason to take Madison Hemings' testimony seriously. He was black. He was the son of an enslaved woman, and his story contradicted the carefully maintained fiction about Jefferson's character. Madison D. And in 1877, for years after giving that interview, his testimony was forgotten, buried in the archives of a small Ohio newspaper that few people read. The truth he told was preserved in an K in paper, but it might as well have been buried with him. No one was listening. By the 1880s, the transformation of Jefferson's legacy was complete. He had become a secular saint of American democracy, his contradictions smoothed over. His relationship with Sally Hemings reduced a scandalous rumor that respectable people didn't discuss. Monticello had been purchased in 1879 by a naval officer named Jefferson Monroe Levy, who began restoring the property. Levy was interested in preserving Jefferson's architectural legacy, not in excavating uncomfortable truths about enslaved people. The South dependency, where Sally had lived, remained collapsed and overgrown. The conspiracy to hide Sally Hemings was never formalized in documents or meetings. It didn't need to be. It functioned through shared interest and unspoken agreement. Jefferson's white descendants protected the family name. Virginia society protected one of their most illustrious sons, historians protected the founding mythology they were constructing, and the nation itself protected the comfortable fiction that the men who wrote about liberty were somehow above the moral compromises slavery required. The room where Sally lived became a metaphor for this erasure. After Monticello was sold in 1831, the new owners had no interest in maintaining the servants' quarters. South dependency was a utilitarian space bill, half underground into the hillside, and without constant maintenance, it deteriorated quickly. The roof leaked, then collapsed. Earth and vegetation covered the foundations. Within 20 years, you could walk across that part of Monticello's grounds and not realize there had been buildings there at all. This physical burial mirrored the high historical burial. By the 1850s, people who had known Sally Hemings were dying off. The enslaved people who had witnessed the relationship were scattered across the South, many still in bondage, their testimonies worthless even if anyone had bothered to collect them. Jefferson's white grandchildren were entering middle age, and they told their children the sanitized version. Grandfather was a great man, These scandalous rumors were lies invented by political enemies. Any impropriety involved the Carr cousins, not Jefferson himself. The lie calcified into accepted truth through repetition and the strategic silence of those who knew better. When James Parton wrote his biography of Jefferson in 1874, he addressed the Sally Hemings allegations briefly, dismissing them with the statement that the family denied it, and their denial ought to be conclusive. Parton had access to Martha Randolph's children, who told him the Carr story. He accepted their version because it was convenient, because it preserved Jefferson's reputation, because questioning it would have required believing the testimony of formerly enslaved people over the word of respectable white Virginians. What's remarkable about Parton's biography is what he chose not to investigate. Multiple people suggested he speak with Israel Jefferson, a formerly enslaved man who had worked at Monticello for decades and had given sworn testimony in 1868 about the Jefferson-Hemings relationship. Parton declined. He also didn't travel to Ohio to interview Madison Hemings despite knowing about the 1873 newspaper interview. The decision wasn't about accessibility. Both men were alive and willing to talk. It was about credibility. Parton had already decided whose version of events was reliable, and it wasn't the people who had actually lived at Monticello as enslaved witnesses to the relationship. This pattern repeated itself with every subsequent biographer. They had access to evidence, farm books showing the timing of Sally's pregnancies, visitor accounts noting resemblances between Jefferson and certain enslaved children, testimony from people who had lived at the estate, and they dismissed or ignored this evidence, because accepting it would have required dismantling the heroic narrative they were constructing. Jefferson was becoming larger than life, a founding saint of American democracy, and saints don't raped enslaved teenagers. By the 1890s, the United States was in the midst of constructing a particular kind of national mythology, the Civil War Washington, as being rewritten as a tragic conflict between honorable men on both sides. Reconstruction was being framed as a mistake, a period of corrupt government and racial upheaval that justified the restorer. Time of white supremacy, Jim Crow laws were spreading across the South, establishing legal segregation and disenfranchisement of black citizens. In this context, any suggestion that Thomas Jefferson H. had fathered children with an enslaved woman was not just personally scandalous, it was politically dangerous. It undermined the racial hierarchies being reconstructed after slavery's end. Think about what was at stake if Americans acknowledged that Jefferson had fathered black children. It meant acknowledging that racial categories were not absolute, that white and black could mix, and the bodies of people who looked white, sounded white, and lived as white. It meant admitting that some of Jefferson's descendants were living as white Americans, indistinguishable from their neighbors, carrying both his legacy and the legacy of slavery in their blood. This was intolerable in an era dedicated to maintaining rigid racial separation. The historical establishment closed raw NKS with increasing sophistication. When Henry S. Randall published his 3-volume biography of Jefferson in 1858, he included a letter from Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randall, Ph., explaining away the Hemings children as products of the Carr brothers. This letter became the standard reference, cited by subsequent biographers as definitive proof that Jefferson was innocent of the charges. The letter claimed that Peter Carr had confessed to being the father while sobbing drunk one night. A conveniently dramatic scene that left no witnesses and no corroboration. The Randolph letter was filled with inconsistencies. It claimed the Carr brothers were at Monticello during the time Sally became pregnant, but plantation records showed they were often elsewhere. It said, instead, Sally had relationships with both Carr brothers at different times, a claim that made no sense given the sequential nature of her pregnancies. But these inconsistencies didn't matter. The letter came from a Jefferson descendant. It was written in elegant prose, and it offered an explanation that preserved Jefferson's honor. That was enough. Meanwhile, the Hemings descendants lived their lives in obscurity, carrying knowledge that the broader world refused to accept. Madison Hemings's children grew up knowing their grandfather was Thomas Jefferson. But what good did that know? Ledge to them, they were black and in America. That was making blackness synonymous with inferiority and disenfranchisement. Claiming Jefferson ancestry didn't open doors, it invited mockery or accusations of delusion. Better to stay quiet, maintain family oral histories privately, and not challenge a historical narrative that had no interest in believing them. Madison's daughter, Ellen Wales Hemings, born in 1832, lived through the entire transformation of Jefferson's image from flawed man to secular saint. She watched as historians wrote books celebrating her grandfather without acknowledging her existence or her father's. She saw Monticello become a tourist destination where visitors learned about Jefferson's genius, while the quarters where her grandmother had lived called set into ruins. She died in 1908, having lived 76 years, knowing a truth that the nation had decided to forget. Eston's descendants, living as white in Wisconsin, had a different kind of silence to maintain. They knew the family story that they were descended from Thomas Jefferson through an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. But speaking this truth meant admitting they had black ancestry in an era of increasingly rigid racial definitions. The one-drop rule was becoming law in many states, defining anyone with any African ancestry as black, regardless of appearance. Wisconsin wasn't immune to these attitudes. Eston's grandchildren watched as their neighbors spoke casually about the inferiority of the Negro race, about the dangers of race mixing, about the importance of maintaining white purity. They stayed silent to protect themselves. to protect their children, to maintain their place in white society. This silence had consequences that plagued their generation's descendants. Great-grandchildren, born in the 1880s and 1890s, grew up not knowing their full ancestry. Their parents had decided the secret was too dangerous to share. These children married white spouses, had white children, and the Jefferson-Hemings connection was lost to their branch of the family entirely. They became exactly what Thomas Jefferson had envisioned when he allowed his children to escape into white society, white Americans with no visible connection to slavery or blackness. Their ancestry erased as completely as if Sally Hemings had never existed. The room at Monticello lay buried under earth and vegetation, visited by no one, remembered by no one except perhaps a few aging black residents of Charlottesville who had aunts or grandparents who once lived in bondage at the estate, but their memories didn't count. They weren't written down, weren't collected by historians, weren't considered reliable, even if one had bothered to ask. The historical record was being written by and for white people, and white people had decided Thomas Jefferson was innocent. Consider what was required to maintain this fictio, and every historian who wrote about Jefferson had to ignore or dismiss the documentary evidence. Every tour guide at Monticello had to skip over the South dependency and focus on the main house. Every textbook author had to present Jefferson as a champion of liberty without mentioning the hundreds of people he held in bondage or the children he fathered with an enslaved woman. The conspiracy required constant active maintenance, not through explicit coordination, but through shared commitment to a particular version of American history. By 1900, the 100th anniversary of Jefferson's election approached, and the nation prepared elaborate celebrations. The anniversary became an occasion to reflect on Jefferson's legacy, to praise his contributions to democracy, to cement his place in the pantheon of American heroes. Speeches were given, monuments were proposed, scholarly papers were published. Not one of these commemorations mentioned Sally Hemings. The scandal that had once threatened Jefferson's presidency had been so thoroughly suppressed that most Americans under 40 had never heard of it. Monticello itself had become a symbol of American heritage. The estate was being maintained as a shrine by its owner, Jefferson Monroe Levy, who opened it to tourists and carefully curated what they would see and learn. Tours were given emphasizing Jefferson's genius and his architectural innovations. Visitors walked through the main house, admired his inventions, stayed in his study, where he wrote letters to other founders. They learned about his presidency, his role in expanding American territory through the Louisiana Purchase, his founding of the University of Virginia. The story presented was heroic, uncomplicated, inspirational. The tour route was designed to showcase Jefferson's brilliance while avoiding uncomfortable truths. Visitors saw his bed in the alcove between two rooms, his clever design allowing him to rise and immediately begin working. They saw the great clock in the entrance hall with its cannonball weights marking the days of the week. They saw his polygraph machine that made copies of his letters as he wrote them. Everything emphasized Jefferson's ingenuity, his rational mind, his contributions to civilization. The tour ended in the gardens where visitors could read the views Jefferson had designed and appreciate his integration of architecture with landscape. What they didn't see was the South dependency. The collapsed servants' quarters remained overgrown, not part of the tour, not part of the story. If a curious visitor asked about where enslaved people lived, tour guides would gesture vaguely toward the hillside and mention that servants' quarters had existed but were no longer standing. The implication was that these spaces weren't important, weren't worth preserving, weren't central to understanding Jefferson or Monticello. The erasure was complete and seemingly permanent. No tour guide mentioned Sally Hemings. No exhibit discussed the enslaved people who built Monticello, maintained it, made Jefferson's life of leisure and intellectual pursuit possible. The narrative presented was of Jefferson as solitary genius, as if his inventions and writings had emerged from pure intellect, unencumbered by the law. Bureau of others, the hundreds of enslaved people who had made Monticello function, who had cooked the meals, tended the fires, cleaned the rooms, worked the fields, raised the livestock, were invisible in this telling, and Sally Hemings, who had lived in the house for nearly 4 decades, who had borne Jefferson's children in that hidden room, was erased most completely of all. This erasure extended beyond Monticello itself. By 1910, history textbooks used in American schools presented Jefferson without complexity or contradiction. Children learned that he wrote the Declaration of Independence, that he believed in liberty and equality, that he was a Renaissance man of remarkable talents. They learned nothing about slavery at Monticello, nothing about Sally Hemings, nothing about the distance between Jefferson's ideals and his actions. The textbooks presented a sanitized version designed to inspire patriotism and pride, not to encourage critical thinking about the founding generation's moral compromises. The University of Virginia, which Jefferson had founded and designed, became another site of erasure. The university celebrated Jefferson as its founder, placing his statue prominently on campus, naming buildings after him, incorporating his architectural vision throughout. Students walked past these monuments daily, absorbing the message that Jefferson represented the best of American ideals. The university didn't discuss the enslaved people who had built the campus, who had served the first students, who had made the university's operation possible, and it certainly didn't discuss Sally Hemings or the children Jefferson had fathered with an enslaved woman. In 1904, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis included a massive exhibit about Thomas Jefferson, celebrating the centennial of the territorial acquisition that had doubled America's size. The exhibit featured documents, artifacts, and reverent descripti of Jefferson's vision and leadership. Millions of visitors passed through learning about Jefferson as heroic statesman and visionary leader. Not one panel mentioned Sally Hemings, not one or Tifa. CT referenced the enslaved people at Monticello. The exhibit was pure hagiography, transforming a complicated historical figure into an unblemished icon. This transformation was intentional and strategic. America at the turn of the 20th century needed heroes, needed founding fathers who represented ideals without contradiction. The nation was expanding its global power, asserting itself as a force for democracy and civilization. Having founding fathers who were also slaveholders and rapists complicated that narrative. Much simpler to quietly forget the uncomfortable parts and focus on the inspiring rhetoric about liberty and equality. The Hemings family watched all of this from the margins. Madison's grandchildren, living in Ohio and other Midwestern states, maintained their oral histories, but found no audience for them. When they tried to tell people they were descended from Thomas Jefferson, they were met with disbelief or hostility. White Americans didn't want to hear that Jefferson had black descendants. Black Americans often didn't believe it either. The claim seemed too grandiose, too convenient, too much like the fantasy people constructed to cope with the trauma of slavery, so the knowledge became private, shared only within families, passed from grandparents to grandchildren in quiet conversations. Don't talk about this publicly. Don't expect anyone to believe you. Just know your history, preserve it, pass it on. Maybe someday it will matter. Maybe someday someone will listen. But for now, in 1910, in an America committed to racial segregation and to heroic mythology about its founders, there was no space for the truth about Sally Hemings. The room remained buried under earth and time, a physical manifestation of historical denial. Archaeological evidence existed beneath the soil. Foundations, artifacts, the material remains of lives lived in bondage. But no one was excavating. No one was looking. The historical profession had decided what mattered and what didn't, who deserved to be remembered and who could be forgotten. Sally Hemings had been categorized as forgettable. Her story dismissed as scandalous rumor, unworthy of serious attention. Think about the coordination required to maintain this erasure over decades. It wasn't a conspiracy in the sense of pay, Opal meeting in secret rooms to coordinate their lies. It was a conspiracy of shared interest, of people independently making the same choice to protect Jefferson's reputation because that protection served their own needs. Historians protected him because their careers were built on celebrating the founding generation. Jefferson's descendants protected him to preserve their family's social standing. Virginians protected him as one of their most illustrious sons, and the nation protected him because the mythology of the heroic founders was essential to American identity. By 1910, his conspiracy had succeeded so completely that the truth seemed lost forever. Everyone who had personally known Sally Hemings was dead. The last of Jefferson's white grandchildren, who had lived at Monticello during the relationship, died in the 1880s, taking their first-hand knowledge to their graves. The physical space where Sally had lived was buried and overgrown. Madison Hemings' testimony existed only in the archives of an obscure Ohio newspaper that few people had ever seen. Israel Jefferson's sworn affidavit had been forgotten. The farm books with their damning evidence were preserved but unexamined. Their significance unrecognized. The room existed now only in archaeological foundations. In the negative space of history, in the silence that spoke louder than words, it stood as testimony to what America chose to forget. What we decided didn't matter. Who we determined was unworthy of historical memory. Sally Hemings lived. Her children lived. The room existed, and for generations. Those who controlled the historical narrative simply pretended none of it had happened. In 1908, an elderly woman in Charlottesville died, her name as Ellen Wells Hemings, Madison's daughter, Sally Hemings' granddaughter. She was 76 years old and had lived her entire life knowing she was Thomas Jefferson's great-granddaughter. She told her children this. They told their children. The oral history continued, quiet and unverified, a truth maintained in private, while public history told a different story. At her funeral, attended by black neighbors who knew her family's history, no one mentioned Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't safe. It wouldn't be believed. The truth had become a secret to be whispered, not proclaimed. The horror of the story is not supernatural. It's the horror of systematic erasure, of powerful people deciding that some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge, of a conspiracy that succeeded, because everyone benefited from the lie. Thomas Jefferson escaped accountability in his lifetime and for generations after his death. The room where Sally lived was buried physically and metaphoric. A lie. Her voice was silenced. Her story was erased, and American history moved forward as if she had never existed. That erasure, that calculated forgetting, that successful conspira, sighed to hide an obvious truth. That's the real horror, not ghosts or curses, but the simple human capacity to look at injustice and choose to look away, to know the truth and choose to bury eye. To hear testimony and choose to dismiss it. The room was real, Sally was real, the children were real, and the conspiracy to deny all of it was real, too, maintained through generations by people who value reputation over truth, mythology over history, comfort over justice. What happened in that hidden room at Monticello shaped American history in ways that would take more than a century to begin reckoning with. But in 1910, no one was reckoning with anything. The room lay buried. Sally's grave was unmarked and forgotten. Her descendants kept their family secrets entombed, as Jefferson remained America's secular saint. The conspiracy had worked perfectly, maintained not through violence or explicit censorship, but through the more insidious means of selective memory, dismissed testimony, and the decision that some voices matter while others don't. Young men at the University of Virginia in 1910 walked past Jefferson's statue on their way to class, in spe. Read by his legacy, never knowing about the enslaved woman who had lived hidden in his house for decades. School children memorized passages from the Declaration of Independence, learning that all men are created equal, never learning about the man who wrote those words holding his own children in bondage. Tourists visited Monticello, marveling at Jefferson's genius, walking over ground that concealed the ruins of the room where Sally Hemings had lived. The room waited in darkness under earth and vegetation, holding secrets that the nation had decided it didn't want to know. The foundations remained patient and silent, preserving proof that the men who shaped American history decided it should remain buried. They succeeded. They buried the truth longer than Sally lived, longer than her CH. Children lived, longer than anyone who had ever known her survived. Fact became rumor. Rumor became scandal. Scandal became a footnote that respectable historians refused to touch, so we have to ask the question history avoided. What really happened in that room? Do you believe the claim repeated for generations that the Carr brothers were the fathers, as Jefferson's white descendants insisted, or do you believe Madison, Hemings, who spoke plainly about his parentage and had nothing to gain from telling the truth? The evidence was always there in plantation records, in visitor logs, in the testimony of enslaved people who witnessed it firsthand. But for more than a century, America chose comfort over truth, chose legend over evidence, chose silence over act. Accountability. If this story moved you, if it made you question who history chooses to believe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button to support stories that textbooks leave out, the truths that make people uncomfortable, because the real horror isn't supernatural, it's human. It's the ability to rationalize cruelty, to erase lives, to destroy evidence while calling it preservation. Leave a comment below, especially if you're watching from Virginia or any where Thomas Jefferson's legacy still looms large. Let's talk about what it means when history is written by the powerful and testimony from the powerless is dismissed. The hidden room at Monticello tells us something essential. What we choose to remember and what we choose to forget reveals more about us than it does about the past. The room is still there, its exact location lost, its existence undeniable. The foundations remain, waiting to be excavated, waiting for a generation finally willing to listen. Sally Hemings lived, her children lived, the room existed. And for generations, those who controlled history pretended none of it mattered. The T is the true horror, not ghosts or curses, but the calculated erasure of a woman who lived, suffered, and died in the shadow of American greatness. Her story buried so deeply that for more than a century, she existed only as rumor and family secret. The room still waits in darkness, and so does the truth.